Welcome to Influential Entrepreneurs, bringing you interviews with elite business leaders and experts, sharing tips and strategies for elevating your business to the next level. Here's your host, Mike Saunders.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Influential Entrepreneurs. This is Mike Saunders, the Authority Positioning Coach. Today we have with us Margot Bloomstein, who's the principal of Appropriate Inc. and author of Trustworthy, How the Smartest Brands Beat Cynicism and Bridge the Trust Gap. Margot, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much.
Hey, so I'm excited to talk about your book because I always love having to dig deeper on some topics that might seem obvious, like, oh, our brand is trustworthy, but maybe not. So let's dive into that. But before we get into it, give us a little bit of your background and then what led you to writing your latest book.
Well, I've been working in business consulting, focusing mostly on content strategy for the past 20-some years. And I've worked with a broad range of businesses, from software and hardware companies and startups and retailers to government institutions and higher ed institutions. And one of the recurring themes around how they use content, where they get content, what they do with content and content strategy has always been around how they use content to build credibility. Because I think if you're a business owner, or if you're the CMO or somebody in charge of marketing or customer experience, you know that until your audience trusts you, until they're willing to kind of buy into you heart and soul, you don't have their attention. They're not going to buy into you with their ears until they buy into you with their heart. So for a long time, I've worked with organizations on how they build credibility, how they build loyalty, and ultimately trust and confidence through content. And then over the past several years, I've looked at how things have changed in the media landscape and in the political landscape, where we're seeing such a rise of cynicism, where so many institutions and political leaders and brands that we thought we knew were starting to kind of gaslight their audiences or demand just complete blind faith. And that's not good either. And I wondered if those issues that I was seeing in the political arena and among media outlets, if those would be affecting my types of clients and the businesses that I work with. And it turns out, yes, those issues, those sort of creeping issues in other industries affect every industry now, every industry in which we engage with consumers or citizens or even engage in B2B context. So I wanted to look at what organizations could do about that, because if people are losing trust in big institutions and in brands that they thought they knew, maybe it's time for other businesses to step into that void, for business to be a force for good and rebuild confidence in their audience and take strategic steps to rebuild confidence and rebuild trust.
I love it. And I always love when people observe things around them. And then they go, ooh, I noticed this, I wonder if, and let's test that hypothesis, and let's try to improve this and polish this up. And where you say credibility, I say authority, because in my practice, I help entrepreneurs be seen as that authority so that they can be the obvious choice. And credibility, authority, very, very similar. I think one thing that you just mentioned that I would like to go a little bit deeper on is, that trust factor could be jaded if a brand is the only one talking about you should trust us because, or building this content on our website. So I would suspect, and maybe this is where you either talk about in your book or we can just discuss here, is when a brand is building the content for the purpose of credibility, it cannot just live on their website or their social media and go, cool, take my word for it. It's got to be being an educator and an advocate for their target audience, for the betterment of what they need to solve their problems. And maybe it needs to be on a multiple number of platforms, that concept of omnipresence. What have you found that way?
Right. I definitely agree. I think that idea of omnichannel strategy, where we're creating a cohesive experience for our audiences across every touch point on which they might engage us, that's so necessary, because whether you've got a huge marketing budget behind you or you're a small startup, it makes sense to look at, well, where are you engaging your audience? And I always counsel my clients, it's better to be on fewer platforms, but ensure they are consistent. So maybe you're not publishing white papers and hosting events and engaging on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and have a big presence on LinkedIn. Maybe just pick a fewer number of platforms to start with, but ensure that they are consistent. Because, I mean, I've had organizations say to me, on Twitter, we only have 140 characters, or now 280 characters. Yep. Do we really have to be on brand there too? And I always feel like, yeah, because if that's the first place your audience finds you, or if that's where they usually engage with you, you only have 280 characters, so you better make sure they're all right and they're all offering the same tone of voice, the same level of detail. And I think getting back to your point around authority, one of the things that I found when I was starting to do research for my book and engaging with different brands and interviewing different CMOs and creative directors and copywriters around how they build trust, so much came back to this idea of authority and unpacking what that means. And I found as I looked across different organizations, being able to educate their different audiences who might be wildly different, but being able to educate them so that their customers felt smarter and so that they felt more confident and like they could make better decisions, that was probably the number one pattern that I was seeing, that they invested in educating and therefore empowering their audiences. Because I usually, when I focus on authority, I define it as being able to share a unique perspective with the right depth of context of basically saying, I'm here, you're not, let me tell you about it. And that's why we trust the authority of certain newscasters when they're maybe reporting to us live from a war zone. They're able to go there because of maybe their expertise, or they're willing to take on a danger or the cost, and their audience isn't. Or when maybe David Chang, the chef behind the Momofuku restaurant chain and the star of Ugly Delicious, when he comes to us and is telling us about Asian, Cajun, fusion, and new restaurants that are popping up, we listen to him because he has authority. He's willing to go places that his audience is not and then come back and tell us about it. And I think anybody that is engaged in marketing, any brand, is able to offer that same level of authority. Because let's say you're the copywriter sitting down the hall from the product development team or the engineering team. You know what the new features are going to be coming down the pike or the product roadmap. You have authority that your audience does not. And being able to speak from that position of authority to say, let me tell you about it so that you can make a more informed purchase decision.
That's a big piece because I'm sure this is said by a lot of people, but I remember it being said by Jeffrey Gitomer that people love to buy, but they don't like to be sold. So you need to introduce ideas to people and teaching concepts so that it's their idea to come buy from you because they've understood all the options and they have made their logical choice from how you are presenting your content. Because no matter what the brand is, you can look at either some of your marketing and sales or your competitors and you can see pushiness. So how do you go as far away from that as possible to educate? And then your target audience goes, ooh, that's a really good point right there. I didn't really realize that. Oh, they provided a link to some research. I'm going to look at that. Oh, wow, I didn't realize that misconception and pro and con. That's a really good, helpful piece of content. Now, content could be a webinar, a podcast, an article, a white paper, all these different things. But I think that really comes down to, maybe even subconsciously the target audience goes, something about these guys just feels right because they're not being pushy.
Right. I think it also comes down to respect, because when businesses invest in sharing that kind of information, of maybe repackaging the product details in a way that it teaches their audience to make a smarter decision, or when they take the time to break down jargon so that they're not dumbing it down for people, but so that instead people can add to their vocabulary and ask smarter questions, that's about saying, I respect that you in my target audience, you have your own interests and goals and your own level of knowledge about this. Let me meet you there and bring you to where I want you to go. Let me help you make better decisions. And you're right, nobody wants to be sold on something, but when they can come to their own conclusions and feel like they're well informed and they can make a confident decision on their own, I think that's what leads to not just an immediate sale, but longer-term loyalty too.
And I think that what you just mentioned about using their language and not dumbing it down, but making it easy to understand, that is being empathetic and kind. And I know that empathy ties into being trustworthy. And I think that even when you do that, I think that people will not consciously think, wow, this is so nice, I must trust them. I just think that they're like, that just really resonates with me, or it just makes sense. And I think, you've heard the old adage, like the top producing salesperson, what do you do to be so successful? And they're like, I don't know. But yet if you were to break it down and have some consultant come follow them around, they would go, well, what you do is we noticed that you asked some really good questions, and then you even discover some of the words that they use, and if they're auditory or if they're kinesthetic, you're saying, oh, well, doesn't that feel right because you noticed that they said some. I think that ties into being authentic. So I guess what I would say is now, is that concept, or is that one of the concept, being authentic, one of the things you teach about how to bridge that trust gap?
Yes, yeah. So in Trustworthy, I break it down through three kind of big topical areas. The framework really for building trust, for operationalizing these ideas, falls into three sections. There's voice, volume, and vulnerability. And in that first section on voice, I look at that refers to how a brand communicates consistently and cohesively, both visually and verbally. So what's the sort of language that you use? What's the tone and pacing of that language? But also, what's the visual style, the kind of graphic language that your business uses in photography and imagery and diagrams? And by maintaining and building that kind of persistent, cohesive, familiar voice over time, that's how your audience gets to know who you are. And I think there's a degree of that in being authentic. It's of knowing who you are. It's kind of what they had carved over the entrance to the temple in Delphi in ancient Greece that said, "Nati sotum, know thyself." So I think the number one thing that businesses can do if they want to build trust with their audience and get to know their audience is first define themselves so that they can be distinct, so that they can know what sets them apart. And I think from there, then you can figure out, well, what's the right volume of content to offer? How much do we need to say so that our audience feels empowered and so that they feel like they can make good decisions? Because we know that, the old thinking was people don't read online. That's not true. Yeah. People do read. They do take in information if it is well created, if it's well written. And I think figuring out the right amount of content, that differs for every business, both the length of your blog post and the length of your articles, as well as like how many images in a photo gallery. So that differs by business, by organization. But you've created enough content when your audience can make good decisions and feel good about the decisions they make. And you can measure that with things like the rate of product returns and the time they spend kind of hemming and hawing about a decision when they put something in the shopping cart.
And also, like you said, things will change from industry to industry or company to company. And I would say my advice would be to be aware of that, but not to get so enamored with, I noticed this, we must change that, because then it's going to be like a seesaw. You push down on one side, like make a fix here, and then it's going to make a change somewhere else, and someone else is not going to. So you can never, ever just make all the changes where everyone is just happy and birds are singing and sunny blue skies. So you've got to be aware of those kind of things. But then I think my opinion is there's a step in between knowing yourself and then knowing how much content to put out. The step is knowing what kind of content to put out. What is it that your audience actually needs, and what do they desire, and what is going to help, educate them and teach them. And I'm sure there's many ways to figure that out. One way is really high tech, and it's really going to take like a PhD to figure this out, but it's called asking them. It's like doing like an informal focus group and just kind of chat with some of your customers. Hey, look, I'm just calling right now out of the blue, and nothing to sell you, but I just want to thank you for being a customer and just want to ask you a few questions. Hey, what do you think about, and how do you consume, and what would you like to know more? Whatever that might look like. And maybe a survey is part of that. Make it brief. Or maybe it's a live Zoom focus group and you send everybody a gift card for participating. But the point is, figure out what it is they need, and then you can do your monitoring of frequency and how they engage and all that. Is that something you've noticed as well?
Definitely. And I think, I love to point out to organizations that trying out different content types online is pretty cheap. You can put up the same information, but present it in both a diagram and maybe in long-form copy and see what is most successful. Ask your audience which they preferred. Look at your site analytics, see which they preferred, and then create more of the thing that is more popular. But I think what you're describing, too, of simply asking them, bringing them into your process, that's actually a lot of what I hit on in the third section of the book. So there's voice, volume, and the third way that organizations can build trust is through vulnerability. And sometimes that means saying, we don't have all the answers, but let's share with our audience how we're getting more of the answers. Let's bring them into our process. Let's prototype in public. And some of the brands that I referenced that do that so well it's organizations you've heard of, like TED. When they've had problems on their site where some of their most ardent critics are saying, wait a second, some of these videos that you've produced are maybe no longer scientifically accurate, or they've fallen out of favor in a particular scientific community, or they're just plain wrong. They've had to take steps to say, well, what do? We don't know how to handle this situation. And what they found that built trust was to draw their critics closer, to say, well, we're trying out different techniques should we take down some old content? Should we couch it in additional information? Maybe tag it in different ways to point you to newer versions of existing videos? And they brought their audience closer to say, what do you think is most effective? And I think taking that approach, whether your organization is on par with TED or much smaller, taking that approach of bringing your critics close, prototyping in public, making them a part of the solution, that's how you convert your critics into champions. Because again, you're showing that you respect their input, that you want them to be a part of the solution. And that's a great way for people to champion your success and changes over time then too.
100%. Well, I think probably we could keep going on for about 3.5 more hours and then take our first breath and keep on going from there. So why don't we wrap up with what's the best way that people can reach out, pick up a copy of your new book, and learn more about building this trust and authenticity and credibility?
Well, I'd love for folks to find it everywhere books are sold. You can find it on Amazon or support the local bookstore in your community, in your neighborhood. And you can find me online at appropriateinc.com. Find the book at appropriateinc.com/trustworthy or on Twitter at @mbloomstein.
Well, Margot, thank you so much for coming on today. It was really fun talking with you.
Thank you so much. Take care.
You've been listening to Influential Entrepreneurs with Mike Saunders. To learn more about the resources mentioned on today's show or listen to past episodes, visit www.influentialentrepreneursradio.com.